afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for the presentations and for the invitation. I had the advantage that some of you may not have had, and that's I got the report in advance and have had a chance to read it. So I was asked to comment on the report and give some impressions about how the report is structured and what it says this year. So first, congratulations to the team from FAO and the collaborators who put it together. The subject of investing in agriculture, as we know, is extraordinarily important right now and in the context of Africa as well as elsewhere. So what I want to look at a little bit is I want to make a few points about what the report says and encourage you to think more about it, and we can discuss it after my presentation with Keith and others. But one thing I do want to say is Keith highlighted the missing data. And the missing data on the foreign direct investment and the domestic investment in agriculture is huge. There's no data in the report on investment in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, in a lot of countries where we know, in Ghana, a lot of countries where we know the amount of both foreign direct investment and domestic investment is huge. So I understand the desire to focus on the smallholder and their contribution to their own, to the investment in agriculture, but I do think we absolutely need better data on private investment, and especially not forgetting about the role of domestic investment. So that's just one critique of the report, and when you look at the data tables that are presented in the report, you can just see that most of Africa has missing data on foreign investment. So the picture is a little bit different, and we know that this is something that's trending upward every year. We can see, everyone who visits Africa can see the impact of investment on agriculture, how quickly it's happening. So it's not a train we can stop. It's something we need to understand. It's something we need to try to assimilate. It's something we need to try to figure out how it can be made a win-win situation. And I think the answer to win-win is exactly this, is that what we need is public-private partnerships. Because investment is happening and governments exist, smallholders are somewhere there, and there has to be a way of bringing all these stakeholders together in the investments, because it's the only way that investment will get done in a responsible way, the subjects of some of the global work that both Keith and Schengen referred to. So I wanted to make these 2 points, but the third point is, in my opinion, and this, when I read the report, this just kept coming up to me, I think the farmers will do their part if the incentive structures around them are right. I don't have any, after 15 years living in Africa and spending a lot of time working with farmers, I don't have any doubt that they'll be able to respond to incentives if those incentives are right. And I wanted to tell a story then after that to try to illustrate this point. And this is the illustration that I'm sure some people know this very area of Eastern Province in Kenya. I spent many, many years trying to understand this part of the world and why the pictures you see there are some very obvious differences in the two pictures. One is the fact that the woman farmer is in the successful farm on the left here, and that was last year's report, so I won't go into the gender dimensions of this comparison. But when you look at these two photos, one of them is a man in a field that doesn't look especially great. He's struggling, he's planting maize. The other one is a woman, and that's sorghum, for those of you who don't know. This problem perplexed me for years. In this area of Eastern Province in Kenya, it is sorghum country. It should be sorghum country. It always has been, and it always should be, but it isn't. And for decade after decade, the farmers refused to plant sorghum. And I struggled to understand what this was about. Why would farmers not produce sorghum when it made so much sense? When they produce maize, 1 year out of 5 they get a harvest. Otherwise, they'll get a little bit, they'll get a couple hundred kilos per hectare, barely enough to survive on. And a lot of years they wouldn't even get enough to survive on. They'd be dependent on food aid. And this problem perplexed me for years. So I spent so much time going and talking to people about why are people behaving this way? I think farmers are rational beings, so why are they doing this? They're not stupid. They're making some decision. There's some incentives that are driving them. And people told me stories. I had lists of stories. There's the bird stories, that it's because of the birds that attack sorghum. And if only you plant sorghum and your neighbors plant maize, you're get attacked and you'll lose everything. So that was one whole track of investigation. Not really true. Each of these things have a kernel of truth, but it's not the main factor. And then it was the kids are in school now. In the old days, the kids weren't in school, so they could chase the birds away. Not really. That's not really the main factor. And there are all kinds of things about food aid. Food aid comes in, so we don't have to worry about it. We just plant what we like to eat because we think maize is cooler than sorghum. And if we don't succeed, somebody will come in and rescue us. Not really, sometimes, but not enough. So none of these explanations, prices, yields, all these things just didn't make sense. And it took a long time for me to understand enough about this that I think I understand the motivation and the incentives that were going on. So just trying to unpack what that decision-making structure of these farmers was. Why were they behaving in some way that seemed irrational? Why were they not investing in producing sorghum, providing for their own food security, and doing something else? And there's a line, this comes from the report, that I think sums it up very clearly, and I added one word into the report that isn't there, and that's farmers and other private investors will invest in agriculture only if the expected returns compensate for the perceived risks, and I highlighted the word perceived, and I inserted a word, consistently exceed returns from alternate types of investment. So this sentence, it's obvious. It's obvious what people do. It's obvious of human behavior, but it's exactly what was going on, in my opinion, why people for decades and decades and decades have not been producing sorghum in an area where they could and should. And the reason is that the farmers didn't want to invest in sorghum because they couldn't sell the surplus. There was no necessary market, where if they threw a bunch of maize seeds on the ground and it happened to rain, kind of did that 1 in 5 years, they would be able to sell everything that they produced. If it didn't rain, well, they'd scrape by. They had enough diverse sources of income that they could scrape by, or someone would come in, some NGO would come in and they'd get food and they would make it through. But their calculation was very complicated and very rational. Their rational calculation was, I need money, and I need to have chunks of investment for different things to save. And if I plant maize, even though it's going to fail 4 years out of 5 or not do very, very well, 1 year out of 5, it's going to be a boon, and I have a guaranteed market in Nairobi. So the farmers, and there was no market for sorghum. So even if they preferred it or didn't prefer it, or birds, or all these other stories, the truth was they just couldn't sell the chance of the surplus. So in understanding their decision-making process, I think what it reveals is that they will invest, and they'll invest in something that makes sense, but it's all about the market being there for them. So what's happening now is some really good news in this part of Kenya. And some people may know about what's happening with East African breweries is now buying sorghum. So we have some questions about the social good of beer making, but as we all know, beer is an essential part of life in parts of the world, including Africa. So what we really need to understand are, what are the risks? What are the risks that the farmers are calculating? They're not simple. They don't make simple decisions. These are complex assessments of risks. And there needs to be a stable market with reliable policy signals and price signals. So what is happening now, and this has only been a couple of years now, is East African Breweries has decided that sorghum can be used in their beer making for a low-end beer. And so they've started to encourage sorghum production in this area. It hasn't been quite as good as you'd expect because, again, complex reasons going on there. People didn't plant all the seeds that they were given. It's like, why wouldn't you plant the seeds? You were given them, or you were given them at a subsidized rate. Well, they didn't plant them because they saved some, because they weren't sure you were going to be there next year with the seeds. So again, rational decision making. They don't trust the market. They don't trust that the inputs are going to be there. So they're not going to put everything in the ground. That would be silly. And then the other thing that happened is people harvested sorghum and they still didn't sell it all to the breweries. They kept some for themselves because they liked it. They had to guarantee their own food security. So again, rational decision making is happening. It just takes a long time to unpack. But it's really about the incentives. So the PPP that's been developed includes the public sector, financial institutions, NGOs, and many layers of the private sector. The public sector, going back to the role of the public sector, they did some things that seemed to be working. Some of them were intentional and some of them weren't necessarily intentional, but they seem to be supporting this development of sorghum in this area and farmers' investment in producing it. They put an import duty on barley. And that forced the brewers to look for something else to use in their beer. They realized that sorghum could work. The government of Kenya also put some restrictions on home brews, on the traditional brews, supposedly for food safety reasons. People can comment on that if they want. But anyway, it created a market for this low-cost beer, and there's more people with a little bit of disposable income, so they want to buy beer at this low cost. There's still a lot of need for research on varieties, because the varieties they're using are from South Sudan that aren't necessarily well adapted. Financial institutions are giving small loans. NGOs are there supporting farmers to learn how to do it. So all those pieces are together. But then there's the role of the private sector. And for the private sector, I include 4 different parts of the private sector. There's the investors, there's the East Africa breweries, there's the middleman and the aggregators who are helping put things together, there are the input suppliers who are getting the seeds and other things out, and then there are the farmers. And so these, to me, are all for the private sector. And all of them have a role, and they all have an incentive. And I think their incentive in all cases is exactly the same. They're all trying to make money. They're all trying to do it. Yeah, there may be more complex issues going on of social responsibility for the companies or something else, but in general, all 4 of these private sector actors are trying to make a living. So when the market is there, when those incentives are right, I know that the farmers will respond. So that was the story that occurred to me in reading the report, that farmers do have the capacity to respond, but it's very complex sometimes why they don't invest in the way we think they should. Thank you.